The coffee in my hand was still hot when my phone rang at 11:40 on a Tuesday night. I almost didn't answer. I was 63 years old. My knees ached from the cold that had settled into Kentucky that November, and I had learned long ago that nothing good ever came from a phone call after 10. But something made me set down my mug and pick up. Maybe it was the particular silence of the house that night. Maybe it was something older than instinct, the kind of knowing that lives in your chest before your brain catches up. It was my daughter-in-law, Margaret. She was crying so hard I couldn't understand the first 3 sentences. "Slow down," I said. "Margaret, breathe. Where are you?" "The parking garage," she managed. "St. Augustine's. Mom, something happened to Daniel. They're saying it was a fall, but he was conscious for a minute, and he grabbed my hand and he said," the line crackled. "He said, Hargrove, he said, don't let them say it was an accident." I was already reaching for my coat. My son Daniel was 41 years old. He was a structural engineer, steady-handed and careful, the kind of man who triple-checked his work and always wore his seatbelt. He did not fall, not from a parking structure, not on a dry night with working lights and a railing he had gripped 1,000 times before. I knew that before I pulled out of my driveway. I knew it the way I had known things about Daniel since the moment he was born, the way mothers know things that can't be measured or explained. By the time I reached St. Augustine's, they had moved him to the ICU. A nurse with kind eyes and tired hands walked me to a waiting room that smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic and told me the doctor would come soon. Margaret was sitting in a plastic chair with her coat still on, her hands pressed flat against her thighs like she was trying to keep herself from shaking apart. Our granddaughter Lily, she was 8, was asleep across 2 chairs with her head on a folded jacket. Someone had given her a hospital blanket. It was the saddest thing I'd ever seen. I sat beside Margaret and took her hand. "Tell me everything," I said quietly, "from the beginning." Daniel had been working late. He was the lead engineer on a development project in downtown Lexington, a mixed-use tower that had been in planning for 2 years. The project was called Meridian, and the primary developer behind it was a company called Hargrove Capital Group. Margaret said he had called her at 7 to say he'd be home by 9. He never came home. A security guard found him at the base of a concrete stairwell on level 4 of the project's adjacent parking structure at 9:47. He was unconscious. His phone was beside him, screen cracked, showing a call that had been dialed but never connected. The call was to me. I sat with that for a long moment. I thought about my son, lying on cold concrete, reaching for his phone, dialing his mother's number in those last seconds of consciousness. I thought about what he must have been feeling, what he must have known was happening to him. I did not cry. I have never been a woman who cries easily. My own mother used to say that I was born with a constitution for survival, and I think she was right. But I felt something harden inside me that night in that waiting room, something quiet and certain and patient, like a stone settling into the bed of a river. I asked Margaret what she knew about Hargrove. She said Daniel had been troubled for weeks. He had come home late several nights, distracted at dinner, quieter than usual. She had assumed it was project stress. 2 weeks before the fall, he had told her, almost in passing, that he had found something in the structural calculations that didn't sit right, numbers that had been revised after his initial sign-off, load tolerances that had been quietly reduced on 3 floors of the tower. He had flagged it internally. He had been told by the project manager that it had already been reviewed and approved by a senior consultant. Did he believe that? I asked. Margaret shook her head. He said the name on the approval didn't match anyone he knew on the project. I asked her if she remembered the name. Colton, she said. A.V. Colton. But Daniel said he'd searched the engineering registry, and there was no licensed engineer by that name in the state. The doctor came before I could say anything more. Daniel had a fractured collarbone, 2 broken ribs, a significant concussion, and a deep laceration across his left palm. Consistent, the doctor said carefully, with grabbing a surface while falling. He was stable, but sedated. We could see him in the morning. I drove home at 3 a.m. I sat in my driveway for a long time. Hargrove. I had heard that name before. Not recently. Not in any context I could immediately place. It lived somewhere in the older parts of my memory. The parts that stored things from before Daniel was born, before I was married, before I had become the version of myself that made coffee at 11 and went to bed at 10. I went inside and I did not sleep. Instead, I went to the spare bedroom, the one I had always called the archive room because that was what it was. My mother had been a meticulous woman. She had worked as an administrative assistant for 31 years, first for a law firm and then for a regional land development company called Bluegrass Holdings, which had operated out of Lexington from 1971 until it was quietly dissolved in 1998. She had believed, with a conviction I had sometimes found excessive when I was young, that you should always keep records. She kept carbon copies of letters. She kept meeting notes. She kept a personal diary from 1974 until the year she died, and she had kept something else, something I had packed into 3 archival boxes when I cleaned out her house 8 years ago and had never fully gone through. She had kept files. I pulled the first box down from the shelf and opened it on the floor and began to read. My mother's handwriting was small and precise. She had organized everything chronologically, with paper clips and hand-labeled tabs. The files from Bluegrass Holdings went from 1979 to 1996, and for the first hour I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Land acquisition records, zoning applications, correspondence with city officials, permits. It was dry reading, the kind of paperwork that made up the invisible skeleton of a city without anyone ever noticing it was there. Then I found a folder labeled simply HCG, internal notes, and I opened it, and the first thing I saw was a name, Hargrove. My mother had written at the top of the first page, in her small, careful hand, Hargrove Construction Group, predecessor entity to current operations. See attached R. Hargrove Sr. and falsified soil reports. Eastview Commons Project, 1987. I read until 6 in the morning. Robert Hargrove Sr. had been a developer and contractor who had operated in central Kentucky throughout the 1980s. He was connected to Bluegrass Holdings through a series of subcontracting agreements. My mother, in her role as administrative assistant, had been present for meetings she was not intended to fully understand. She had transcribed notes she was expected to file and forget, but she had made copies of things she didn't think were right. Specifically, she had copied internal correspondence showing that Hargrove Sr. had submitted falsified geotechnical reports for at least 2 projects, reports showing soil stability that did not match independent assessments she had seen referenced in passing. One of those projects was a residential development in the eastern part of the county. A building there had experienced significant foundation settling in 1991. 3 families had been displaced. A lawsuit had been filed and then settled quietly with sealed terms in 1993. No one had gone to prison. No one had lost a license. Hargrove Sr. had died in 2004, and his company had continued under his son. His son, whose name was listed in my mother's notes as a junior signatory on 2 of the documents she had copied. Garrison Hargrove. I looked up Hargrove Capital Group on my phone. The founder and CEO was listed as Garrison Hargrove, 64, a prominent figure in Kentucky real estate development. There was a glossy profile from a business magazine 2 years ago. He was photographed in front of a building he had developed. He was smiling. He looked like a man who had never once worried about accountability. I thought about the name Daniel had whispered to Margaret in that parking garage. I thought about the load tolerances that had been quietly revised. I thought about V. Colton, who did not exist in the engineering registry. And I thought about my mother, sitting at a desk in 1987, making copies of things because something didn't feel right, filing them away, keeping them, not quite knowing why. She had known why. She just hadn't known for whom. I called my sister just after 7 in the morning. Her name is Patricia, and she is 67, and she has never once in her life taken anything sitting down. Do you remember what Mama kept from Bluegrass Holdings? I said when she picked up. There was a pause. I remember you told me she kept files, Patricia said slowly. I never looked at them. I looked at them last night, I said. Patricia, Garrison Hargrove is the developer on Daniel's project. Silence. Tell me what you need, she said. What I needed, I had decided in the hours between 5 and 7 that morning, was not a confrontation. It was not a phone call to Hargrove Capital Group. It was not a rushed conversation with the police based on a box of 30-year-old documents and a whispered name in a parking garage. What I needed was someone who could tell me whether what my mother had kept was legally significant and whether what had happened to Daniel could be connected to it in a way that would hold up to scrutiny. I needed a lawyer who was not afraid of a powerful man. Patricia knew one. She had used him in a property dispute 10 years ago and had described him then as the kind of man who read every word twice and never made promises he couldn't keep. His name was Gerald Whitmore. He was 70 years old, semi-retired, and when I called him at 8 in the morning and told him I was sorry to call so early, he said, "Don't be." He had been up since 5. I met Gerald at his office that afternoon. I brought the 3 archival boxes. I also brought the notes I had typed up in the early morning hours, a timeline, as clearly as I could construct it, connecting Hargrove Sr.'s documented conduct in the 1980s, the Eastview Commons settlement, Garrison Hargrove's inheritance of the company and its patterns, the Meridian Project, the falsified engineer name, the revised load calculations, and Daniel's fall. Gerald read everything. He took 2 hours. He did not interrupt me, did not ask questions until he had finished, did not offer any opinion while he was reading. When he finally looked up, he took off his glasses and set them on the desk and was quiet for a moment. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," he said. "She was," I said. "This is not enough to prove what happened to your son," he said. "Not by itself, but it is potentially enough to open a very uncomfortable door for Garrison Hargrove." He paused. "The falsified documents from 1987 are past the statute of limitations for criminal prosecution, but they establish a pattern. And if the Meridian Project contains the structural irregularities your son identified, that is not past anything. That is a present and active risk to public safety." He tapped the folder with V. Colton's name. "A fabricated professional license is fraud. That's current. That's actionable. What do we do?" I asked. "You don't do anything," he said, not unkindly. "You let me make some calls. I will not pretend the next 3 weeks were easy. Daniel came home from the hospital after 5 days. He was slower than usual, careful on stairs, and he had a way of pausing mid-sentence sometimes, as if the words had briefly gone somewhere he couldn't reach. The doctors said it would pass. I sat with him in the afternoons when Margaret was at work and Lily was at school, and we talked about small things, the bird feeder in my backyard that the squirrels kept dismantling, a book he was reading, whether the kitchen faucet needed replacing. We did not talk about Meridian. We did not talk about Hargrove. I did not tell him about my mother's files. I needed him to rest. I needed him not to carry it while he was healing. I carried it instead. Gerald moved quickly and carefully. He brought in a licensed structural engineer, not connected to any Hargrove project, to independently review the Meridian building plans through a contact at the city permits office. The engineer's report, delivered in 11 days, confirmed what Daniel had flagged. The load tolerances on floors 14 through 17 had been reduced below code requirements in a revision submitted 2 months after the original engineering sign-off. The revision bore V. Colton's signature. V. Colton, as Gerald's investigator confirmed, was the name of a man who had died in 2019. Someone had used his credential numbers on a forged document. Gerald contacted the Kentucky State Police and the FBI field office in Louisville on the same day he received the structural report. 3 days later, agents arrived at the offices of Hargrove Capital Group with the warrant. I heard about it from Gerald. I did not watch. I had no desire to see it happen. Some people, I know, want to be present for the moment of reckoning, want to see the face of the man who hurt their family when the walls close in around him. I understand that impulse. I have felt it. But I have also learned that the most important moments are usually the quiet ones. The ones that happen in archival boxes and yellow folders at 3 in the morning. The ones that your mother built piece by piece without knowing exactly what she was building. Garrison Hargrove was indicted on 7 counts, including fraud, falsification of engineering documents, and criminal endangerment. The Meridian Project was halted pending a full structural review. 2 other Hargrove capital projects in the state were also flagged for investigation based on documents my mother had kept from the 1980s. Documents that, taken together with current evidence, established a pattern the prosecutors said was exactly what they needed. Daniel called me the evening the news broke. It was a Thursday, mid-December, and ice had been forming on the back roads since noon. He said he had just seen it on the news. "Mom," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" "Since the night you were in the ICU," I said. He was quiet again. I could hear him breathing. "You didn't tell me," he said. "You needed to heal," I said. The rest was already handled. He asked me how I had known where to look. I told him about my mother's boxes, about the folder labeled HCG, about the copies she had made of things that didn't feel right, filed away in a spare room for 30 years, waiting. "She kept all of that," Daniel said slowly. "She kept all of it," I said. She didn't know why, but she kept it. There was a long pause. I heard him exhale. "She was protecting someone she hadn't met yet," he said. I have thought about that sentence many times since. He was right, I think. My mother had no way of knowing what those files would mean. She had no way of knowing her grandson would one day take a job with a company run by the son of the man she had watched do dishonest things in the 1980s. She had no way of knowing that the pattern would repeat, that history had a way of circling back, that the powerful counted on people forgetting. She just kept the records, because she believed that the truth, documented and preserved, was never entirely powerless. That even when the moment hadn't come yet, the moment would come. Garrison Hargrove's trial began the following September. I did not attend. Gerald kept me informed. The prosecution used my mother's files as evidence of prior pattern, not as criminal charges in themselves, but as context that helped the jury understand that this was not a single mistake, not a first offense, not a man who had simply made a poor decision under pressure. It was a way of doing business. It had always been a way of doing business. He was convicted on 5 of the 7 counts. He was sentenced to 11 years. The Meridian building was ultimately demolished. A city council member who had approved the original permits resigned. 3 other executives at Hargrove Capital Group entered plea agreements. It was, Gerald told me, one of the more significant construction fraud prosecutions in the state in 20 years. Daniel went back to work in the spring. He joined a smaller firm, one that did mostly infrastructure work for the county, bridges and drainage systems and school renovations. He came home for dinner on Sundays now, more consistently than before. Lily had started a science project about bridge engineering that she wanted to show me every time I visited. Margaret laughed more than she had in the year before all of this. On a Sunday in April, after dinner, Daniel helped me carry 2 of my mother's archival boxes back up to the spare room. The 3rd box, the one with the Hargrove files, was with Gerald, archived now as part of the legal record. Daniel lifted the first box and paused at the doorway of the spare room, looking at the shelves. "Should we go through the rest of these sometime?" he said. I thought about my mother, about the 31 years she had spent filing and organizing and quietly paying attention, about all the things she had documented that I had not yet read. "Yes," I said. "I think we probably should." He nodded and set the box on the shelf. Lily appeared in the doorway behind us, already in her coat, asking if we were ready to leave. Daniel put his hand on my shoulder briefly, just a moment, nothing dramatic, and then we turned and followed her out. That is what patience looks like, not waiting for someone else to fix it, not hoping the powerful will eventually answer for what they've done. It is a woman at a desk in a 1987 making an extra copy of a document because something is wrong and she cannot prove it yet, but she believes the time will come. It is a daughter who does not throw away what her mother left behind. It is understanding that justice is rarely loud and rarely fast and almost never arrives on schedule, but it arrives.